Continuing on from the Kirk era's most messed up demises, the Next Generation found new and equally creative, equally unhinged ways to dispatch its characters. If you did want to avoid the worst of fates, it was probably best to stay away from the Enterprise D entirely. If not, then at least watch where you're walking. Of course, one of the most infamous of awful exits in TNG, which won't be featuring on this list because, well, quite frankly, we've already covered it to death on this channel, was that of Tasha Yar. Personally, I feel sorry for all those poor officers who had to process the 24th century death certificates. The cause of death was what now? If you say so, Dr. Crusher. Well, with that in mind, I'm Ellie for TrekCulture, here with the 10 most messed up deaths in Star Trek The Next Generation. Number 10, Called Me Mother, Commander Remick and Parasite. If you can stomach the body horror of it all, the final fate of Lieutenant Commander Dexter Remick in Conspiracy was without a doubt one of the worst in Star Trek. Although his fictional serial killer first namesake would have just probably called that breakfast. Just how long Remick had been walking around with Mother Buttbug inside him was never made clear. But given the size of the thing, it's no wonder he needed a good sit down near the end there. "You don't understand," Mother Remick says to Picard and Riker. No, not completely, and I prefer we keep it that way. Everyone ends up learning a lot more than they bargained for about Remick's innards and buttbug biology when Riker and Picard aim both their phasers and fire. Their combined power causes the Lieutenant Commander's head to explode, followed unceremoniously by melting chest effect exposing Mother, who emerges snarling like she's been disturbed mid-xenomorph reunion. Picard then gives a look of most mild disgust, as though someone had just scuffed the bridge carpet rather than just eviscerated a fellow Starfleet officer. And of course, the crew of the Horatio was still very dead. Number 9, Death to the Dekion Field, crew of the Enterprise D. Round and round they go. Where the temporal causality loop stops, nobody knows, until Data figures out why 3 is the magic number. The cold opener to Cause and Effect is one of the most dramatic put to screen. What a way to announce a reboot with a whole new cast! Of course not. This was just one of those weirdly beautiful Star Trek technicalities in the Typhon expanse. They were all back to playing poker soon enough, worry not. Death, deal, repeat. Death, deal, repeat. If having your molecules ripped apart by a warp core breach several times over weren't bad enough, the most messed up thing was that even though each loop was a reset, the crew became more and more aware that they'd done it all before. This wasn't deja vu, this was deja vécu, which literally means already lived, and lived, and lived. More than that, when Dr. Crusher realised she was not just hearing voices, but actually hearing voices, Geordi and Data figured out that they were in fact listening to themselves, the crew on a path to disaster, echoes of the Dekion Field. Now they had the MP3 of their own doom! Number 8, Nightmare on Helm Street, crew of the Britannia. What went down on the Britannia was a waking nightmare. Not heard from after sending out a distress call 29 days prior, by the time the Enterprise D showed up, all of the crew were dead, having murdered each other in several manners, one more brutal than the last. The rescue in Rescue Party is moot in this instance, as the team from the D beamed over. The captain of the Britannia had been stabbed through the chest by a rather hefty-looking dagger. One crew member had had half of their flesh melted away by a phaser on a setting of 6 or 7, and 2 other bridge officers were cause unknown, save for a horrible head wound and a dab of dried blood. Aboard the Britannia, the night terrors were made manifest. 34 dead by their own often bare hands. It turned out that the Britannia had become trapped adrift in a Tychon's Rift, an energy-absorbing rupture in space. And now the Enterprise D was stuck there too, oh yay! Whilst rare and tough to escape from though, Tychon's rifts don't usually cause people to kill. There were telepathic aliens in this one too, however, and their mental distress call was preventing REM's sleep in everyone but the Betazoids. If you've ever felt a little homicidal without that coffee in the morning, that's but a fraction of how messed up it was for the crew of the Britannia. Number 7, Miller, Yuri, Q, Who, All Life on Earth. When doctoral candidate Stanley Miller and supervisor Harold Urey were running their famous experiment that set out to reproduce the atmospheric conditions thought to have existed on Earth between 3.5 and 4 billion years ago, the primordial soup, in order to demonstrate that organic molecules could indeed be produced from inorganic compounds in such an environment, they weren't counting on an anti-time eruption as a factor for the chemistry. When Q transported Picard back to his extremely old stomping grounds in All Good Things, however, whilst there were already amino acids present on that prebiotic Earth, they had been stopped short of forming the first protein by the anomaly. There's the everyone dies and then comes back to life messed up, and then there's the all good things, every animal, plant, fungus, protist, bacterium and virus will never have existed on Earth in the first place kind of messed up. It is estimated that as of 2022, the number of humans to ever have lived was in the order of 117 billion, and who knows how many more by the 24th century and beyond. Plus, in the far, far, far distant past, the anti-time anomaly, which Picard had technically created with the convergence of 3 inverse tachyon pulses, filled the entire Alpha Quadrant. That's a whole lot of extra effed up non-existence before Jean-Luc was able to figure it all out. Number 6. Rocky Rebellion, crew of the Pegasus. No good deed or mutiny with the best of motivations goes unpunished. Captain at the time, Eric Pressman's plan to outmatch the Romulans by ignoring the Treaty of Algeron was less than solid, and as a result, a good number of the crew of the Pegasus who stood up to him ended their lives as a rock. Unfortunately, in this case, they weren't just going through a phase. In 2358, when a test of the experimental and illegal, I might add, phasing cloak went horribly wrong aboard the USS Pegasus, only 8 of the crew, including Ensign Riker, who didn't join the rebellion, made it off the ship with Pressman alive. From the vantage point of a coward's escape pod, it then looked as though the Pegasus was destroyed in a warp core explosion. In fact, what they'd seen was plasma from overloading relays igniting in space. The damaged USS Pegasus then drifted into a phased state, only for the cloak to fall at the worst possible moment, killing everyone who had remained on board. The rest was covered up and classified until Riker faced his very own kind of rock and a hard place. Number 5. Death is better than small talk, baryon sweep bye-byes. Had Captain Janeway been there, she would no doubt have designated Commander Calvin Hutchinson a bit of a windbag. Of course, the smallness of his talk doesn't mean he deserved to be shot dead without so much as a saddle to defend himself, but you know, eventually there is only so much one can say about the weather and the mating habits of the Akarian hornfowl before disruptors are drawn. And no, I will not call you Hutch. At least back on the Enterprise D, in Starship Mine, there was no time for idle chit-chat. Get to the point or get hit by the baryon sweep. That was indeed the fate of most of the trilithium resin thieves after Captain Picard disabled their field diverter. In fact, Picard had already nerve-pinched and sedated one of the meddling mercenaries, Devore. Oh, hello there, Tim Russ. And presumably he was still sleeping when the sweep got to him. And he also wasted no time setting a Jeffries tube trap for Sattler. All we heard was a scream as the latter was being hit face first by a deadly wave of green. Picard then proceeded to crossbow another and turn 10 forward into a gunpowder gauntlet. Head mercenary Kyros managed to escape, but not before Picard had ensured that she would meet a highly explosive end. That's really a rather lot of killing for a Starfleet captain. Although, arguably, he wasn't left with too much of a choice. Plus, at least it finally gave the crew of the Enterprise D something to talk about. Number 4. T-cell hack breaks the ensign's back. Ensign Dern. When the captain's away, the progressively de-evolving crew will play. And kill. Don't forget the kill. All it took was a teeny tiny synthetic T-cell sent to fight off Lieutenant Barclay's Uridelan flu for all aboard the Enterprise D to turn to mayhem and murder in Genesis. With an arachnid, proto-hominid, and whatever Worf was amongst others roaming about, it's a wonder there weren't bodies lining the corridors. As it happened, there was only one confirmed death. Ensign Dern. Since everyone was going back to the wild ways, Dern's death was particularly savage. It's never stated who killed the con officer, but Proto Riker was only in the other room. Just saying. It would have to have been someone with the ancestral strength to break an upper spinal column. in 3 places, as per Data's in situ autopsy report. Just spitballing here, but that also does make pure concentrate of Klingon Worf a suspect too. Not only did Dr. Crusher's hack lead to a broken back, poor Ensign Dern, technically no name unless you watched the end credits or read the script, also suffered severe lacerations to his chest and neck. By the "I didn't sign up for this" look on his face, eyes wide open in horror up to the ceiling, and the amount of blood, those wounds were made before death. His console also didn't do too well out of it either. Number 3, I shot a spooky doppelganger of a man, one Picard, another Enterprise D. In some mythologies, the appearance of your ghostly double is considered to be a harbinger of death. I suppose in this case, death depends on who was the omen for whom. Things were already messed up from the very beginning of Time Squared. Dr. Pulaski was clearly expecting an omelette, but Riker made rotten scrambled eggs instead. It was out in the middle of nowhere, for Starfleet and the Federation at least, that the Enterprise D bumped into the ashen-faced facsimile of Captain Picard from 6 hours in the future. Suffering from some major 24th century jet lag, dazed and confused whilst his body clock realigned, the other Picard spent his final hours alive in a semi-unconscious, nightmarish state, being shouted at by himself aboard the ship, his ship he'd seen destroyed not long before. In order to end the cycle, the non-temporarily displaced Picard barely hesitates in grabbing a phaser from the handily located and hardly secured shuttle bay locker. Picard shoots his other self dead without batting an eyelid, and then goes back to the bridge to leave Dr. Pulaski with the mess. And more effed up still than all of that, O'Brien then has to bear witness to his dead captain. Why? Isn't he going to suffer enough? Number 2, the polymerization experiment, Lieutenant Hagler. There are yet more spooky goings-on for the crew of the Enterprise D in schisms. Riker's having trouble sleeping, and it's not because of his cooking. Geordie's losing connection, Mott's losing his grip on the scissors, and Data's losing his chronometer. I think a little poetry is apt for this one. A polymer's doom. Then we went to a room for some time and observed why a handful of crew from the ship were perturbed by the clicks and the ominous light overhead. We did miss the lieutenant not tucked up in bed. Okay, that's not quite the poetic heights of Data, if heavily inspired by his verses, but hopefully you get the point. Lieutenant Edward Hagler probably just wanted some peace and quiet in his fancy pajamas, but instead he was kidnapped and experimented upon by a gang of life forms from subspace. The last we saw of Hagler, he was heavy heaving through his blue-grey, deoxygenated face. We only know he died because Riker remembered to mention that fact near the episode's end. Not much of a eulogy, certainly not very poetic, but definitely messed up. Number 1, flaw in the floor, Lieutenant Van Meter. In theory should be just remembered for its dictionary definition of a double entendre on the part of Data. However, whilst the rub of the plot is the deadpan android's algorithmic try at a relationship, the rest of the intrigue centres on the exploration of a dark matter nebula and the mysterious occurrences aboard the Enterprise that result. Aside from Picard having to tidy up his ready room and from Spot suddenly getting a cat flap, there was little overly alarming about the odd incidents at first. That is until Lieutenant Van Meter suffered one of the worst fates imaginable. In joining Commander LaForge and Ensign Thorne to go check out potential structural damage between decks 36 and 37, Van Meter found out exactly what was between decks 36 and 37. Organ and bone-crushing death is what was there. Don't worry though, Data has now confirmed his hypothesis at least, so whew, that's okay then. The high amounts of dark matter in the nebula were causing gaps in the fabric of normal space, meaning that the floor had basically just opened up and then closed back around Van Meter. All we heard were her agonising screams before Geordie and Thorne rounded the corner to find only half of the very dead lieutenant popping up out of the carpet. Yikes. And there you have it. Do go and check out our video covering the same topic for the original series, and keep your eyes peeled because we will be covering all the other series as well. Let me know if you think I missed a really glaringly obvious one in the comments down below, and make sure you head over to all the social media pages and give us a follow. In the meantime, I've been Ellie for TrekCulture. I hope you have a wonderful day, and remember to boldly go where no one has gone before.